There is a material sitting inside the bodies of hundreds of millions of living people right now, and their immune systems have no idea it's there. Not because doctors suppressed the immune response, not because of any medication, because the material itself is so chemically strange that the most aggressive biological defense system evolution ever produced looks straight at it and sees nothing worth fighting. And that's just the beginning of what this material has done. It was forged inside a star that exploded before our sun existed. It was stolen from a superpower by its greatest enemy, without that superpower ever finding out. It was banned from food in one part of the world, while being actively used to kill bacteria in hospitals in another. And right now, as you listen to this, a paralyzed person somewhere is moving a cursor on a screen using only their thoughts, through a device encased in this exact material. We have been using it for decades. We barely understand it. And the more you look at its history, the more one specific feeling starts to settle in, and it doesn't go away. The feeling that we didn't choose this material, that it has been here, patient and quiet, waiting for us to catch up. The element is titanium, element number 22 on the periodic table, and I need to tell you something important before we go any further. This story does not start in a laboratory. It does not start in a factory or a military base or a surgeon's theater. It starts in space, several billion years before any of those places existed. But we are going to get there by a very specific route, because the most interesting thing about titanium is not where it came from. It is where it ended up. And I mean that in the most literal, physical, biological sense possible. It ended up inside us. Not as a tool we carry, not as a machine we operate. Inside the structure of the human body itself, fused to living bone, running living hearts, wired into living nervous systems. That has never happened with any other material in the history of our species. And understanding how it happened and what it means requires going back to a moment that almost nobody knows about. A moment in a small research lab where something went wrong in exactly the right way. But first, I need you to feel the weight of what we are actually talking about. Because the numbers and the science are one thing. The physical reality of it is something else entirely. Friends, if you are finding this as fascinating as I do, please subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely helps this reach more people who would want to hear it. Pick up whatever is closest to you right now. A mug, a phone, a set of keys. Hold it in your palm and feel the weight of it. Now imagine that weight, that exact heft, as something that has been living inside a person's knee for 30 years. Not sitting next to the bone, not attached to the outside of it, fused into it, grown into it, so thoroughly incorporated into the living tissue that a surgeon trying to remove it today would have to break the bone to get it out. That is what a standard knee replacement looks like after a few years inside a human body. And here is the thing that stops me every time I think about it. The body did that voluntarily. Nobody programmed the bone cells to do it. No drug tells them to grow toward the metal. The living tissue just, on its own, decided that the titanium surface was something worth attaching to, something worth building around, something that felt, at a biological level, like it belonged there. And meanwhile, the immune system, this extraordinarily sophisticated network that will launch a full inflammatory response against a splinter the size of a grain of sand, sits completely quiet, watches the whole process happen, does nothing. I have spent a long time trying to find a comparison that captures how strange this is, and the closest I can get is this. Imagine you have a guard dog that has been trained over 400 million years of evolution to attack anything unfamiliar that enters the house. This dog will bark at a leaf that blows in through an open window. It has occasionally, on bad days, growled at the furniture. And then one day, someone walks in through the front door, carrying a fist-sized chunk of metal and sets it down in the middle of the living room floor. And the dog walks over, sniffs it once, and goes back to sleep. That is your immune system around titanium. And what makes it even stranger is that this is not how the body behaves around other metals. Put stainless steel inside a joint, and the surrounding tissue begins a slow, grinding inflammatory response that builds over years. Certain alloys used in older implants were found to be gradually releasing microscopic amounts of metal ions into the surrounding tissue, detectable in blood tests. Nickel, which appears in enormous quantities in everyday objects, triggers allergic responses in roughly 1 in 10 people. But titanium produces none of this. No ion release into blood, no protein binding, no macrophage activation. Silence. And the reason for that silence is something so small you could stack 10,000 of them across the width of a human hair. And the implications of that reason are going to take us from a basement laboratory in Northern Europe all the way to the inside of a star. Your immune system has made a catastrophic mistake every single day of your life, and you have never once noticed. I'm not being dramatic. The system that is supposed to protect you from everything foreign, everything that does not belong inside your body, has been systematically fooled by a layer of chemistry so thin it makes a soap bubble look like a brick wall. And before we get to how that trick works, I need you to really understand what kind of system is being fooled here. Because calling the immune system a defense system is like calling the ocean a puddle. It is technically accurate and completely misses the scale of what you are dealing with. Think about what this system does on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. You walk outside and breathe in a cloud of tree pollen. That pollen is chemically inert. It cannot infect you. It cannot replicate inside you. It poses exactly zero biological threat to your survival. And yet for millions of people, the immune system detects those microscopic particles, classifies them as a potential danger, and launches a full inflammatory response, complete with swollen tissue, fluid production, and the whole cascade of symptoms we call an allergy. The system is not malfunctioning when that happens. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is respond aggressively to anything it cannot immediately classify as safe. Now take that same system and put a chunk of metal inside a major joint. Not a tiny splinter, a component the size of your fist, made of a material that absolutely did not exist inside the human body for the previous 400 million years of vertebrate evolution. And watch what happens. Nothing. Complete silence. No swelling. No inflammatory cascade. No macrophages rushing to surround the foreign object. The guard dog, as I described it before, just goes back to sleep. And the reason that happens is sitting right at the surface of the metal, invisible to every optical instrument ever built, doing its job so perfectly that 4 centuries of accumulated biological intelligence cannot tell it is even there. The explanation starts with oxygen, which is everywhere, and speed, which in chemistry can mean something very different from what we normally picture. The moment a piece of titanium is exposed to air, even the slightly humid air of a surgical theatre, a reaction begins at the surface. Not a slow reaction, not a gradual one, a reaction that completes itself in a time frame so short it is essentially instantaneous from any practical human perspective. What forms is a layer of titanium oxide, just a few nanometers thick. Now, I know nanometers sounds like a word that belongs in a physics lecture, so let me give you something more tangible. The period at the end of a printed sentence is roughly 500,000 nanometers wide. The oxide layer on titanium is between 2 and 6 nanometers thick. We are talking about a coating that is literally a few dozen atoms deep. You could stack tens of thousands of these layers on top of each other and still not reach the thickness of a single human hair. And this layer, this almost fictional thinness of chemistry, is what the immune system actually encounters when titanium is placed inside the body. Not the metal, the oxide. And here is why that distinction changes everything. Metals that cause problems inside the body, the ones that trigger inflammation and ion leaching and allergic responses, cause those problems because they interact. They release charged particles into surrounding fluid. They bind to proteins in the blood. They give the immune system something to grab onto, something to react to, something that registers as chemically active and therefore worth attacking. Titanium oxide does none of this. It does not release ions into blood. It does not bind to plasma proteins. It sits there, chemically inert, registering at a biological level as something closer to a smooth river stone than a foreign implant. The immune system scans the surface, finds nothing that matches its library of threats, and moves on. The metal is hiding in plain sight, behind a disguise that is only a few atoms thick, and the disguise has never once failed. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody predicted. Not the engineers who first started working with this material, not the surgeons who first considered implanting it, not even the researchers who eventually figured out the oxide mechanism. Because the immune system going quiet is only the first half of what happens. The second half is something the body does entirely on its own, with no instruction, no encouragement, and no precedent in the entire history of materials science. And it starts not with the immune system backing down, but with a completely different set of cells waking up and doing something that, by every rule of biology, they should have no reason to do. Living bone grows into metal the same way a tree grows into a fence post, and nobody asked it to. Nobody programmed it. Nobody developed a drug that triggers it. The body just does it, on its own, because something about the surface of titanium speaks a language that bone cells have apparently always known. And when I say grows into, I do not mean loosely attaches to, I mean physically penetrates. The bone cells, the ones responsible for building and repairing bone tissue, make contact with the titanium surface and begin behaving in a way that is completely different from how they behave around any other synthetic material. They spread out flat against the surface like they're trying to cover as much of it as possible. They divide. They start secreting the proteins that form new bone matrix, and they do it right up against the metal, filling in every microscopic groove and pit and texture in the surface. And over the following months, something happens that no imaging technology can fully capture in real time, but that every surgeon who has ever tried to remove a long-term titanium implant knows intimately. The boundary disappears. There is no longer a line where metal ends and bone begins. There is just a continuous structure, metal flowing into bone matrix flowing into metal surface. The two so thoroughly interlocked that the only way to separate them is to fracture the bone itself. This is called osseointegration, and it is, without any exaggeration, one of the strangest and most consequential biological phenomena that modern medicine has ever learned to use. And the word use is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because the honest version of it is this: we learned to use it before we understood it. We are still using it before we fully understand it. The complete molecular sequence of events, from the first contact between a bone cell and an oxide surface to the finished integrated structure, is still an active area of research. We have been placing titanium inside human bodies for decades on the basis of a phenomenon we cannot fully explain. And the reason we started doing it at all traces back to a single afternoon in a research facility where a scientist made a discovery he was not looking for, in a material he had barely thought about, while trying to solve a completely different problem. The man's name was Dr. Alan Marsh, and in the early part of his career he had no particular interest in materials at all. His world was blood. Specifically, the way blood moves through the microscopic vessels inside living bone, a subject that in his early research years was almost entirely unstudied and poorly understood. The tools available to study it were primitive. If you wanted to observe microcirculation inside a living bone in real time, you essentially had to build your own instruments from scratch because nobody had needed them before in quite the way Marsh needed them. So that is what he did. He designed a series of small cylindrical observation chambers, hollow optical devices that could be implanted directly into bone tissue, allowing him to look inside and watch the blood moving through capillaries at the microscopic level. The chambers needed to be made of something that would not corrode, not deform under the mechanical pressure of surrounding tissue, and not interfere with the blood flow he was trying to observe. A colleague in the engineering department suggested titanium. Light, strong, seemed reasonably stable in biological environments based on the limited data available at the time. Marsh agreed without much deliberation. The material choice felt like a minor administrative decision compared to the actual science he was trying to do. He had the chambers machined, implanted them into the leg bones of a group of research animals, and began his observations. The work went well. Over several months, he collected the data he needed, watched the capillary behavior he had come to study, filled notebooks with measurements and observations. And then, when the research phase was complete and it was time to close out the experiment, he went to retrieve the chambers. And they would not move. He applied careful pressure. Nothing. He tried a slightly different angle. Nothing. The chambers were locked in place with a solidity that made no sense given how recently they had been implanted. He called in a colleague to get a second opinion. The colleague tried. Same result. They looked at each other across the examination table in a small room that smelled of antiseptic and warm metal, and there was a long pause where neither of them said anything. Because what they were looking at had no immediate explanation. The bone had not just healed around the chambers, it had grown into them, fused with them at a structural level that should have taken years to develop, if it was even supposed to develop at all. Any reasonable scientist in that room would have written the word complication in their notes, ordered new chambers in a different material, and moved on with the actual research. Marsh wrote one word in his notes that afternoon that changed everything. He wrote, "Curious." That one word, curious, written in a notebook in a quiet lab, ended up changing the lives of hundreds of millions of people. But not quickly, not cleanly, and not without Marsh spending years doing work that most of his colleagues thought was a complete waste of time. Because here is the thing about that afternoon when the chambers would not come out. The easy interpretation was obvious and available to anyone in that room. The implantation technique had caused an unusual healing response. The specific animals used had some biological quirk. The chambers had been left in too long. There were at least 4 reasonable explanations that required no further investigation and allowed everyone to move on with their actual research agenda. Marsh rejected all of them. Not dramatically, not with some grand declaration. He just kept pulling at the thread. He started systematically. He prepared a new series of implants with deliberately varied surface textures, some smooth, some roughened to different degrees, some with microscopic grooves cut into them in specific patterns. He implanted them in different locations, different bones, different animals, different durations. He kept meticulous records of every variable. He took his time. There was no funding pressure pushing him toward a result. There was no conference deadline. There was just a question that would not leave him alone, the same question he had written in his notebook that first afternoon. Why did the bone do that? And the data that accumulated over the following years was consistent in a way that ruled out every convenient explanation one by one. It was not a quirk of the animals. It happened across every species he tested. It was not a fluke of technique. It happened with every implantation method he used. It was not a function of duration. It happened within weeks. It was the surface. Specifically, it was the titanium oxide surface. Bone cells encountered it, recognized something in its texture and chemistry that nothing in their evolutionary history had prepared them for, and responded by doing the one thing bone cells know how to do. They built. And the rougher the surface, the more texture it had at the microscopic level, the faster and more thoroughly they built. Marsh spent a long time sitting with that finding before he was willing to say out loud what it suggested. Because what it suggested was not a laboratory curiosity. It was a medical application. And the gap between a laboratory finding and a medical application is enormous, filled with ethical review boards and safety protocols, and the very reasonable concern that what works in an animal bone might behave completely differently in a human one. The first human patient Marsh ever approached about a titanium implant was a man named David, a retired carpenter in his mid-50s who had lost most of his lower jaw to a combination of injury and the surgical treatment that followed it. David had spent years trying to manage with conventional prosthetics, the kind that sit against the gum line and are held in place by adhesive and whatever bone ridge remains beneath them. They moved when he chewed. They caused sores. He had essentially stopped eating anything that required real biting force, which meant he had quietly restructured his entire diet around foods soft enough to manage without putting the prosthetic under pressure. He told Marsh during their first meeting that he had not eaten a piece of bread with a real crust in 4 years. He said it the way people say things they have made their peace with, matter-of-factly, without self-pity. Marsh listened to him and then explained what his research had shown. He explained it carefully, without overselling it, because he genuinely did not know yet what would happen in a human jaw. He told David that what he was proposing had never been done before, that the procedure itself was straightforward, but the outcome was unknown. That it might work exactly as the animal data suggested, or it might not. David looked at him for a long moment, and then asked one question. He asked whether Marsh believed it would work. Marsh said yes. David said, "Then let us try it." The surgery took place on a grey Tuesday morning in a hospital that smelled of floor cleaner and recycled air. Marsh placed 4 titanium posts into what remained of David's lower jaw, working with the careful precision of someone who understood that he was either beginning something important or making a very expensive mistake. The posts went in. David recovered. And then they waited. 3 months. 6 months. The posts did not loosen. No inflammation. No rejection. No pain. At the 8-month mark, Marsh attached the final prosthetic bridge to the posts, and David bit into a piece of crusty bread for the first time in 4 years. Marsh was standing in the room when it happened, and he said later that the sound of it, the actual physical crunch of that bite, hit him somewhere he had not expected. Not in his scientific mind. Somewhere else entirely. But what happened next was not celebration. What happened next was silence of a completely different kind. Because when Marsh began trying to share his findings with the wider medical community, the response he got was not curiosity. It was not even skepticism in the open-minded sense. It was something colder than that. The medical establishment told Marsh, politely but clearly, that his results were probably wrong. Not fabricated, not dishonest, just wrong. The kind of wrong that happens when a researcher gets too attached to a finding and starts seeing patterns that are not really there. The conference where he first presented his accumulated data was held in a large auditorium with good lighting and uncomfortable chairs. And Marsh stood at the podium with years of careful work behind him and watched the room while he spoke. He could feel it. The particular quality of attention that is not really attention at all. The way people hold their faces when they have already decided and are simply waiting for the presentation to end. A senior surgeon in the front row asked a question afterward that was worded politely enough but carried a clear subtext. The subtext was, "Why are you still pursuing this? The existing standard worked." Removable prosthetics had been the answer for generations. Patients managed. The idea that you could place a metal post into living human bone and the bone would voluntarily and permanently fuse to it, that it would hold so firmly that the patient could load it with full chewing force for the rest of their life, it sounded like the kind of claim that belonged in a popular science magazine rather than a clinical journal. Marsh did not argue. He thanked the panel for their time and went back to work. He expanded the patient group. He introduced standardized follow-up protocols at regular intervals, monthly for the first year, then every 6 months, then annually. He brought in colleagues at other institutions to replicate the procedure independently, so the data would not carry the bias of a single researcher with a single patient cohort. He was building something that could not be argued with, not because he was angry at the skeptics, but because he understood that data at a certain volume and consistency stops being a matter of opinion. It either holds or it does not. His held. Patient after patient, institution after institution. The follow-up periods stretched from 1 year to 3 years to 5. No rejections, no late-stage failures, no inflammation emerging years down the line the way some critics had predicted. The posts stayed. The bone stayed fused to them. The patients ate, spoke, lived normally with hardware in their jaws that their bodies had completely claimed as their own. By the time the dataset was large enough that even the most resistant voices in the field were running out of alternative explanations, a quiet transformation had already begun in surgical centers that had been paying close attention. The technique was spreading. Slowly at first, then faster, the way things spread when the evidence finally becomes impossible to root around. And within roughly a decade from that cold reception in the auditorium, Implant dentistry had gone from a fringe experimental procedure to a standard of care practiced in clinics across the world. Today, that field generates more than $5 billion annually. All of it built on the foundation of one researcher who refused to write the word complication and wrote curious instead. Now, here is the part that will genuinely surprise you, because it surprised me when I first encountered it. After everything I just described, after the decades of work, the clinical proof, the transformation of an entire medical field, the hundreds of millions of patients whose quality of life was permanently changed by what Marsh and those who followed him built, there is one institution that remained completely unmoved by all of it. And that institution is the one that is supposed to recognize exactly this kind of contribution. Marsh never received a Nobel Prize. The discovery of osseointegration, a phenomenon that has now improved the daily physical experience of a significant fraction of the entire human population, was passed over. And I want to be careful here, because this is not a simple story of injustice. The Nobel system has its own logic and its own constraints, and second-guessing it from the outside is easier than actually running it. But the pattern is worth naming honestly. The prize tends to follow a certain kind of discovery. Abstract, theoretical, fundamental at the level of physics or chemistry or molecular biology. A mechanism that can be written as an equation. What Marsh did was messier than that. It was clinical. It was material. It was the kind of knowledge that reveals itself through patients recovering and data accumulating over years, rather than through a single elegant experiment that fits on a slide. The system had no clean category for it, and so the system looked away. Marsh received honors from medical societies and universities across multiple countries. His work is cited in thousands of papers. His name is known to every oral and maxillofacial surgeon alive. But the specific weight of official recognition that the scientific world treats as the final word on significance, that never came. And here is the thing I keep coming back to when I think about that. The material itself seems entirely indifferent to the question. Titanium does not need a prize committee to validate what it does inside a living bone. It just keeps doing it. Quietly, permanently, with that same chemical patience it has been applying since long before any of us existed. And speaking of before any of us existed, we need to talk about where the titanium actually comes from. Because the answer is not a mine. It is not a geological formation. It is not even this planet. And once you understand where every single atom of this metal originated, the story of what we have done with it starts to feel very different. Most people assume that titanium is rare because it costs so much. That assumption is completely and demonstrably wrong, and the people who profit from the myth have never had much reason to correct it. Titanium is the 9th most abundant element in the Earth's crust. Let that number sit for a second. 9th. There is more titanium in the ground beneath your feet than there is copper. More than chromium, more than nickel, lead, zinc, and tin combined. You can pick up a random rock from a riverbed almost anywhere on the planet, and there is a reasonable chance it contains some form of titanium compound. It has been found in lunar samples brought back by space missions. It shows up in ocean floor sediments, in granite, in clay, in the black volcanic sand on beaches that most people walk across without a second thought. This is not a scarce material. It is one of the most geologically widespread elements on Earth. So why does a single titanium dental implant cost more than many people earn in a week? Why did this supposedly everywhere material spend the better part of a century locked inside classified programs, available only to governments with specific military needs and essentially no one else? The answer has nothing to do with how much of it exists in the ground. It has everything to do with what happens the moment you try to do anything useful with it at high temperature. At room temperature, titanium is calm, stable, almost indifferent to its surroundings. It sits behind that oxide layer we talked about earlier and reacts with essentially nothing. But heat it past a certain point, roughly 600 degrees, and something shifts completely. The calm disappears. The metal becomes chemically hungry in a way that is almost aggressive to watch if you know what you are looking at. It starts pulling oxygen out of the surrounding air and absorbing it directly into its own structure. Then nitrogen, then hydrogen. All of them diffusing into the metal at high temperature and changing its internal structure from the inside out. And the result of that absorption is not a stronger material. It is a brittle one. A titanium component that has been contaminated by atmospheric gases during processing will crack under loads that a properly processed piece would handle without any difficulty. This means that every stage of melting, casting, and hot working titanium has to happen inside a completely sealed environment. Either a hard vacuum or an atmosphere of inert gas that chemically cannot react with the metal no matter what temperature you reach. And building and operating that kind of infrastructure costs enormously more than a standard steel furnace. The ore itself arrives as a compound, locked inside minerals with names most people have never heard, and extracting pure metal from those compounds without ever letting the hot product touch air is an engineering challenge that defeated chemists and metallurgists for over a century after the element was first identified. Dozens of serious attempts, all of them producing the same result. A metal that was either contaminated, brittle, or produced in quantities so small they were scientifically interesting and industrially useless. Which brings us to the man who finally solved it, not by finding a more powerful chemical reaction, but by changing the entire physical architecture of how the reaction was allowed to happen. His name was Victor Hale, and he came to the problem from an unusual direction. He was not primarily a chemist. He was an engineer who had spent years working on contained industrial processes, systems designed to perform complex chemical reactions in sealed environments where the atmosphere inside the reactor could be precisely controlled. He had built systems for other reactive metals. He understood the logic of containment at an industrial scale in a way that most of the chemists who had tried to solve the titanium problem before him did not. When he looked at the history of failed attempts to produce pure titanium, he saw a pattern that the previous researchers had not framed clearly. Every attempt had assumed that the goal was to find the right reducing agent, the right chemical that would strip the oxygen away from titanium compounds cleanly and leave pure metal behind. Hale looked at the same history and reached a different conclusion. The chemistry was not the problem. The problem was that every approach, at some point during the reaction, exposed hot titanium to the atmosphere. Even briefly. Even at a stage the researchers had considered safe, and brief was enough. He designed a process in 2 stages that never, at any point, allowed hot titanium to contact air. The first stage converted the ore into a liquid intermediate compound that could be purified by distillation at manageable temperatures. The second stage took that purified liquid into a sealed reactor flooded with inert gas, introduced a reducing metal, and ran the reaction to completion inside a closed system that was not opened until the product had cooled to room temperature. The output was a porous grey mass, rough and sponge-like, that could then be vacuum melted into usable metal. The purity was something the field had never achieved before at any meaningful scale. And sitting in that sealed reactor, cooling slowly in its inert atmosphere, was the first batch of titanium that was genuinely ready for the world. Or, more precisely, ready for the part of the world that was about to need it most urgently. Because the timing of Hale's breakthrough was not an accident. It landed directly inside one of the most intense periods of military and technological competition in human history. And the people who noticed it first were not doctors or engineers or scientists. They were people in rooms with no windows, reading reports that were not meant for public circulation, making decisions about what this material could be made to do at speeds no one had yet attempted. The people in those windowless rooms had a very specific problem. They needed an aircraft that could not be caught, not outmaneuvered, not confused by electronic countermeasures, simply outrun. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. If the aircraft moves faster than anything sent to intercept it, it comes home every time. And the speeds they were targeting was not a modest improvement on existing designs. They wanted something that flew at roughly 3,500 kilometers per hour, more than 3 times the speed of sound, at altitudes above 24 kilometers, where the air is so thin it barely registers as atmosphere. At that speed, the air itself becomes a problem. When a surface moves through air at those velocities, friction generates heat. Not the gentle warmth of a car window in summer, real structural heat. The kind that softens aluminium to the point where it can no longer carry load. The engineering team working on the project ran the thermal calculations and arrived at a number that ruled out every conventional airframe material in a single step. The skin of the aircraft at cruise speed would reach temperatures that aluminium simply could not survive with its structural integrity intact. Steel would handle the heat, but steel is nearly twice as dense as titanium, and the weight penalty would make the performance numbers impossible to achieve. There was only one material that sat at the intersection of all the requirements: high strength at elevated temperature, low enough density to keep the aircraft within its performance envelope, chemically stable in the operational environment. The answer was the same metal that Victor Hale had finally learned to produce in industrial quantities: titanium. Roughly 85% of the airframe would be built from it. This was not a design choice, it was the only choice the physics allowed. And the moment that decision was made, the engineering team walked directly into a wall of problems that none of them had fully anticipated. Because working with titanium at the scale and precision required for an airframe was, at that point in history, largely uncharted territory. The cutting tools used to machine titanium wore out at rates that seemed almost deliberately hostile. A tool that would last through hundreds of steel components would be blunted after a fraction of that work on titanium. New tooling had to be designed from scratch. Machined components were coming out of the shop with surface finishes that looked acceptable, and then developing microscopic cracks days later for reasons nobody could immediately identify. It took weeks of investigation to trace the cause to the water used to cool and clean the parts during machining. Ordinary tap water contains trace amounts of chlorine. At the temperatures generated during cutting, that chlorine was reacting with the titanium surface in ways that created invisible stress points that later propagated into visible cracks. The fix was simple once identified: use distilled water for everything. But finding that fix cost time and components, and the particular kind of exhausted frustration that comes from chasing a failure mode that leaves almost no visible evidence. There were rules that emerged from months of hard experience that would have sounded absurd to anyone outside the program. No pencil marks directly on titanium surfaces. Graphite reacts with titanium at the temperatures generated during later processing and creates brittle spots at the contact point. No fixtures with certain metal coatings. Specific coating materials caused surface embrittlement in titanium under heat. Even the seasonal temperature variation in the production facility turned out to matter, because titanium's thermal expansion behavior meant that parts machined to correct tolerances in cool winter conditions came out fractionally oversized during a hot summer, and fractionally was enough to fail inspection. Every single one of these problems was solved. All of them. The team worked through them one by one with the methodical patience of people who understood that the alternative to solving the problem was abandoning the project entirely. And what came out of that process was not just an aircraft. It was the world's most intensive industrial education in how to work with titanium at scale. Every technique, every workaround, every hard-won understanding of how this material behaves under real manufacturing conditions, all of it fed directly into the broader knowledge base that would later make titanium available for medical implants, for commercial aviation, for deep-sea exploration. The aircraft was the crucible, and it flew exactly as designed. No interception, not once. But the most extraordinary detail about that aircraft was not its speed, or its altitude, or its operational record. It was where the metal came from. Because here is the thing that was sitting quietly inside this entire program, invisible to almost everyone involved at the operational level. A logistical reality so strange that when it eventually became known, it sounded like something a novelist had invented. The titanium used to build this aircraft, the aircraft designed to perform surveillance flights over the territory of a specific rival power, came in significant part from that rival power itself. Not through some oversight, not through a loophole that was later closed. Through a deliberate, carefully constructed operation run by an intelligence agency that had understood the supply problem clearly and had decided that the geopolitical sensitivity of the procurement was simply another engineering challenge to be solved. The world's accessible high-quality titanium supply was concentrated in a small number of countries, and one of those countries was the exact nation the aircraft was being built to monitor from the sky. Direct purchase was impossible. The two powers were in a state of sustained political opposition that made official commercial contact on strategic materials completely out of the question. So the solution was to make the contact invisible. A network of trading companies was established, registered in countries that had normal commercial relationships with both sides. These companies placed orders for industrial titanium through entirely legitimate-looking channels. The paperwork described standard civilian applications. The payments cleared through ordinary commercial banking. The metal arrived at warehouses in neutral countries, was transferred through a sequence of intermediary steps designed to obscure its origin and destination, and eventually found its way to the production facility where it was machined into airframe components. The rival power filled those orders reliably and on schedule, quarter after quarter, because from their perspective, they were simply selling industrial metal to neutral commercial buyers. They had no reason to look harder at the customers. The customers looked completely ordinary. And meanwhile, the metal traveled step by step through a chain of paperwork and geography until it arrived at a facility where it was shaped into the exact instrument that would fly over the country that had mined and processed and sold it, photographing whatever the operators on the ground had decided was worth photographing that week. The aircraft flew those missions without a single loss, and the country that supplied the metal never intercepted a single flight. Not because they did not try. For decades, a compound of titanium was hiding in your food, and the people who put it there never seriously asked whether they should. Not titanium metal. Titanium dioxide. The same oxide layer that makes a surgical implant invisible to your immune system, scaled up, powdered, and added to everyday products for one reason only: to make them look whiter, brighter, more visually appealing on a shelf. It appeared in chewing gum, in the coating on certain candies, in the white shells of tablets and capsules, in powdered coffee creamers, in cake glazes and sugar coatings, and a dozen other products where pure white was considered more commercially attractive than the slightly off-white that the actual ingredients produced naturally. The regulatory logic behind its approval was circular in a way that is uncomfortable to examine too closely. It had been used for years without anyone immediately dropping dead from it, therefore it was probably safe. Therefore it continued to be approved. Therefore it continued to be used. Nobody asked what happened when you consumed it every day for 30 years. Nobody ran the studies that would have answered that question because nobody was required to. The approval had already been granted. The burden of proof had quietly shifted to anyone who wanted to challenge the status quo, rather than to the people who had introduced the substance into the food supply in the first place. And then a major food safety authority decided to actually look. Not a cursory review, a full scientific reassessment, pulling together all the available research from laboratories across multiple countries, running it through a systematic evaluation process, and asking a straightforward question. Can we establish a dose of this compound that is safe for daily consumption over a lifetime? The answer, after years of work, was no. Not because the compound had been proven harmful at typical consumption levels. The evidence was not that clean or that simple. The problem was more unsettling than a direct causal link would have been, because a direct causal link you can quantify and manage. What the assessment found was that a portion of every commercial sample of this compound consisted of particles small enough to be classified as nanoparticles. And nanoparticles of the same substance behave differently from larger particles of that substance. This is not specific to titanium dioxide. It is a general principle of how matter behaves at that scale. Particles below a certain size can cross biological barriers that stop larger particles completely. They can reach places inside the body that the same substance in a larger form cannot. And when researchers examined what happened when nanoparticles of titanium dioxide interacted with living cells, they found evidence that the particles could enter cell nuclei. And once inside a cell nucleus, they showed what the assessment described using careful regulatory language as genotoxic potential, meaning the potential to interact with and damage DNA. That phrase does not mean causes cancer. The evidence did not support that direct conclusion. What it meant was that the risk could not be excluded based on the available data. And if you cannot establish a safe daily dose, you cannot responsibly keep the substance in the food supply. The compound was banned across an entire major economic bloc. The decision was not unanimous globally. In most of the rest of the world, it remains on approved lists today. Regulatory bodies in other regions reviewed the same underlying science and reached different conclusions about how much certainty is required before action is warranted. That disagreement between regulators is still unresolved. What is resolved is this. For a significant portion of modern history, something was added to food purely for visual effect, without the long-term safety data that the question deserved, and millions of people consumed it daily without knowing it was there. That is not a conspiracy. It is not a dramatic revelation. It is simply how the approval system worked in practice, and the titanium dioxide story is one of its clearer illustrations. Now, hold that thought, because what comes next requires you to carry two contradictory facts in your head at the same time. The same compound. The same titanium dioxide that was just removed from food in one part of the world because its nanoparticles showed potential to interact with DNA, that exact same compound is currently being used in hospitals to kill bacteria on surfaces without any chemical disinfectant at all. The same substance. Radically different context. Radically different outcome. And the reason it can do that second thing is a property so extraordinary that when it was first reported in a scientific journal, researchers around the world read the paper and immediately started thinking about energy crises and hydrogen fuel and the end of fossil fuels. None of that happened, at least not yet. But what did happen is quietly as remarkable in a different way. The discovery came from a graduate student working in an electrochemistry lab, running experiments on semiconductor materials and their behavior when exposed to light. His name was James, and on the day that changed his research direction entirely, he was doing something fairly routine. He had submerged an electrode made of titanium dioxide in a container of water and was shining a lamp on it while monitoring the electrical output. What he was not expecting was for the water to start splitting. Not boiling, splitting, releasing hydrogen gas at the electrode surface without any external electrical input. Just light hitting a surface and water coming apart at the molecular level. He checked the setup. He checked it again. He called his supervisor into the room. The supervisor looked at the readings, looked at the electrode, and said nothing for what James later described as an uncomfortably long time. The mechanism, once they worked through it, was genuinely elegant. Titanium dioxide is a semiconductor. When a photon of ultraviolet light hits its surface with sufficient energy, it knocks an electron loose from its normal position. That displaced electron leaves behind a vacancy, a gap with a strong positive charge, and that gap is chemically aggressive in a very specific way. It pulls electrons from water molecules at the surface, breaking the bonds that hold the molecule together and generating in the process one of the most reactive chemical species in existence, a hydroxyl radical. And hydroxyl radicals do not discriminate. They attack whatever organic molecule is closest. For water splitting, that means hydrogen gets released. For bacteria sitting on a coated surface, it means their cell walls are destroyed within hours of light exposure, without any chemical disinfectant, without any consumable material, without any active intervention from anyone. The surface just sits there, under ordinary light, and keeps the area clean. Operating rooms in several hospital systems now use tiles coated with a nanometer-thin layer of this compound. The same compound, pulled from food for safety reasons, is simultaneously keeping surgical environments sterile and saving lives. That tension between those two facts does not resolve neatly, and the story of titanium is full of exactly these kinds of collisions between different truths about the same material. But none of them quite prepare you for where the story goes next. Right now, while you are listening to this, the boundary between human and machine has already been crossed, and almost nobody noticed when it happened. Not in a science fiction way, not with drama or announcement. It happened quietly, in operating rooms, in rehabilitation centers, in the bodies of ordinary people who needed their lives back. And titanium was the material that made it possible every single time. We talked about what happens when bone grows into a metal surface and refuses to let go. We talked about the immune system going silent. We talked about a retired carpenter named David, who bit into a piece of bread for the first time in 4 years after a titanium implant fused permanently into his jaw. That was the beginning of something. What came after it is a different scale of story entirely. Today, there are hundreds of millions of people alive with permanent titanium as a structural component of their skeleton. Not a temporary fix, not a removable device. A permanent, load-bearing, biologically integrated part of the body. Hips, knees, spinal segments, jaw, skull. The bone grew into it, the immune system accepted it, and at some point after that integration completed, the question of whether the metal is part of the person or a separate object inside the person stops having a clean answer. It is both. It is neither. The language we have does not quite fit the reality. But the structural implants are actually the simpler end of what this material is now doing inside human bodies. Because there is a category beyond structural. There is active. A pacemaker enclosed in a titanium housing does not support a failing heart the way a crutch supports a weakened leg. It runs the heart. The electrical signal that tells the cardiac muscle when to contract, that signal comes from the device. Switch it off and the heart loses its rhythm. The device is not helping the organ. It is performing the organ's primary function. Tens of millions of people are alive right now because a piece of engineered hardware in a titanium case is doing something their own biology can no longer do reliably on its own. And from there, the trajectory only moves in one direction. Neural stimulators came after pacemakers. Devices implanted into specific structures of the brain to deliver precisely timed electrical pulses that suppress the pathological signals causing tremors in conditions like Parkinson's disease. Titanium housing, permanent implantation, cellular-level interaction with living neural tissue. The device is not communicating with the nervous system in any abstract sense. It is participating in it, interrupting signals, modifying outputs, changing what the brain does in real time. And then came the interfaces. A young man named Marcus, paralyzed from the shoulders down after a diving accident, received a device the size of a shirt button implanted directly into the surface of his motor cortex. The device contained over 1,000 electrodes in contact with living neurons. It was enclosed in titanium. Within days of implantation, Marcus was moving a cursor on a screen using only the intention to move. Not a joystick, not a sensor on his skin. The neurons in his motor cortex that used to send signals to his arms were still generating those signals. The device was reading them, decoding them, and translating them into outputs that reached the external world through a wireless connection. He played chess online. He composed messages. He did things with his thoughts that his body could no longer do on his behalf. And the titanium case sitting against his brain tissue was doing what titanium has always done in biological environments. Nothing visible, no inflammation, no rejection, just quiet, permanent, invisible presence, while the real work happened around it. The boundary that separated technology from the human body for the entire history of our species is not a line anymore. It is a gradient. And we are somewhere in the middle of it, moving further in one direction, with no map of where that direction ends. Where that direction ends is a question nobody can answer. And I want to sit with that for a moment before we close this story out, because the full picture of everything we have covered deserves to be held together all at once. We started with a surgical theatre and a piece of metal smaller than a fist that a living body decided to make its own. We went back through a century of failed attempts to extract a useful material from rock. until one engineer sealed the process completely and changed everything. We went further back to a cold conference room where a researcher stood at a podium and watched a room full of experts dismiss 30 years of clean data because it did not fit the shape of what they expected progress to look like. We went back to an intelligence operation so precisely constructed that an entire government was unknowingly supplying the material for a program designed to observe it from above. We went into food packaging and hospital tiles and the surface of the moon and the interior of a dying star. And now we are here, at the edge of what comes next, which is a place where the division between the biological and the engineered is dissolving not through conquest, but through compatibility. Through the simple chemical fact that this material and living tissue are, at some fundamental level, willing to coexist in ways that nothing else we have found can match. And I keep coming back to the same thought when I try to hold all of this together. Every significant thing that titanium has done in human history arrived through a door that nobody planned to open. The osseointegration was a failed retrieval. The industrial process was an engineer solving a containment problem, not a chemistry problem. The spy plane was an engineering emergency that accidentally became the world's greatest manufacturing school. The photocatalysis was a student running a routine experiment who happened to notice that something impossible was occurring in a glass container of water. None of it was predicted. None of it was the goal. The material kept revealing new properties through situations that looked, at first, like problems. And every time someone stopped long enough to ask why the problem existed, instead of just solving it and moving on, something remarkable followed. That is the thread running through everything in this story. Not the material itself, the habit of attention. The willingness to look at an unexpected result and feel curious instead of inconvenienced. Marsh wrote that word in his notebook on the afternoon the experiment failed. Curious. And that single word, that choice to stay with the question rather than route around it, built an industry that has restored quality of life to hundreds of millions of people. Victor Hale did not invent a new chemistry. He asked why every previous approach had failed in the same specific way, and the answer to that question was the breakthrough. James did not set out to discover photocatalysis. He noticed something strange happening in a container of water and decided it was worth understanding. The titanium itself did nothing intentional, it simply behaved according to its nature, consistently, at every temperature and pressure and biological environment it encountered. We were the variable. Our attention was the variable. So here is the question I want to leave you with, and I want you to actually think about this because I think your answer might surprise you. If a material that has been in the ground for 4.5 billion years is now fused into human bone, running human hearts and reading human thoughts through titanium-encased electrodes in living brain tissue, and we still do not fully understand the molecular mechanism behind the most basic of those interactions, then what exactly are we claiming when we say we have mastered this material? Are we using titanium, or have we simply made ourselves useful to it for a while? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you land on that. And if this story made you think, made you see something familiar in a completely different way, please subscribe and leave a like. It takes 2 seconds and it helps this reach the next person who needs to hear it.